The Time Machine, Chapter 8, Down to the Bad Place. I was afraid to turn, clenching my hands. I stared back into the glaring eyeballs. Suddenly I remembered the Eloy's strange terror of the dark, but I refused to let it overpower me. I conquered my fear a bit and stepped forward. "What are you, anyway?" I said harshly. I put out my hand and touched something soft. The eyes shifted, and a white shape ran past me. With my heart in my mouth, I turned to see a weird little ape-like figure. Its head held down peculiarly as it ran across the sunlit space behind me. It stumbled against a stone block, and in a minute was hidden in a black shadow under another ruin. It went too fast for me to see the creature clearly, but I knew its body was dull white and hairy, and it had strange, large, gray-red eyes. I couldn't tell if it moved on all fours or ran with its forearms held low. I followed it out into the open field, and at first I thought it had given me the slip, but when I reached one of those well-like openings I had seen earlier, I wondered if it could have slipped under the dome and disappeared down the shaft. I leaned over the top of the well and lit a match. The small white creature was staring up at me as it retreated down the shaft. The creature gave me the shivers because it looked so much like a human spider. As it clambered down the well, I became aware of a series of metal foot and hand rests that formed a kind of ladder down the shaft. Then my match went out. By the time I lit another, the thing had vanished. Little by little, the terrible truth dawned on me. Now I understand, I thought. Man has not remained one species, but has branched into two distinct animals. My delicate child people of the upper world are not the only descendants of my generation. This horrible white underground monster that flashed before me is also my descendant. Troublesome riddles filled my mind. These underground beasts, who I later found out were called Morlocks, had probably taken my machine, but why? But why? And since, as I believe, the Eloi were their masters, why hadn't they made the Morlocks give it back? I decided to confront my little friend with my question. "Weena, dear," I said, "there is something I wish to know." "Ask then, O my life-giver," she replied in the Eloi language. "See this grass," I said, pointing. She smiled and said, "Pretty grass grows green." I pulled up a clump. "And underneath the grass is soil, right?" As she looked a bit nervous, but brought herself to say, "Soil to feed the grass and flowers." "And now, Weena, you must tell me, what is below the soil down there?" I said firmly, as I pointed to the hole where the clump had been. Weena's eyes shut tightly, and her little body shivered. She looked about to faint. "Weena!" I shook her gently. Her eyes fluttered, as she seemed to recall my last question, and then bursting into tears, she clutched at my arm as though for protection. Those, by the way, were the only tears I ever saw in that future world. "It's all right, Weena," I soothed. "I won't bring up the subject again." She continued to look distressed. I had to think of something to change her mood. "Look, Weena, look." "See the bright light?" I said, as I lit a match. I struck one match after another until she was smiling and clapping her hands again. She trotted along then, as I resumed my exploration of the area. Late in the day, we passed one building, which I decided I'd have to explore later. This bluish-green structure, with an oriental look, was larger than any of the palaces or ruins I had yet seen. I would have checked it out right then and there, but something else was nagging at me, something I was trying to convince myself to do. "You must do it," I kept telling myself. But another voice within me kept fighting. "You've still got to check one of those shafts," I told myself. "But their touch is so filthy cold," said my other voice. "All the same, you'd better do it now. Soon the moon will be going through its last quarter, with the sky darkened, and there'll only be more of those creatures around. Little Weena danced beside me as I walked to the wall. But when she saw me lean over the oak, she let out a pitiful cry. No, no, not to look down there. Who's looking? I'm counting on climbing down there. No, forbidden to put hand in shaft. Shaft grows from the bad place, she cried, pulling me away. I've got to find my machine. Don't be so worried. Goodbye for now, little Weena. Shaking a bit, I looked down the shaft. I would be going down about 200 yards by means of narrow metal bars intended for smaller, lighter creatures than myself. I tossed my legs over the side and began my descent. Midway down, one of the metal bars broke under my weight, almost swinging me off into the blackness beneath. Painfully, I clung by one hand to the bar above, and I knew I had to move fast so it wouldn't happen again. I looked up briefly and saw a tiny dark blue circle of light. It was the night sky, with a star in it. Weena's head looked over the edge. It was no more than a small black lump. Chapter 9. A Terrible Truth. At last I reached the bottom, and found a narrow tunnel in the wall. Full of painful aches, I curled up to rest. I don't know how long I lay there before I was startled by a soft hand touching my face. Quickly striking a match, I saw 3 of the white creatures bending over me. The sudden brightness sent them off. They didn't seem to be afraid of me, but the light terrified them. They reminded me of fish that live in underwater darkness, whose pupils, too, are abnormally large and sensitive, and reflect light. Now from dark gutters and tunnels, the Morlock's eyes were glaring at me in strange ways. I tried talking to them, but found their language completely different from the Eloi. Face it, I told myself. You're in this alone, and you'd better start moving. Feeling my way around the tunnel, I heard the noise of an engine running some kind of machinery. As I walked along, the noise grew louder. When I reached a large, open space, I struck another match and discovered myself in a vast, arched cavern. I have only a hazy impression of what I glimpsed before the match went out. Ghostly Morlocks were lurking about, blobs of huge machinery, and a sort of white table with some kind of meal on it. A rather large animal stood in the center. I wondered what large animal had survived in this world to furnish the red meat I saw. The place was stuffy. What little air there was in this open space had the smell of fresh blood. Fool, I thought to myself, how could you have come on a trip like this with no weapons, no food, and no medicine? And if only I had thought to bring a camera, I would have been able to take quick shots and study them later on at my leisure. Here I stood like an idiot, with none of those basics, and only 4 matches left. I had wasted half the box in showing off to the little people in the upper world. Suddenly a hand touched mine, and cold fingers brushed my face. The unpleasant smell of the Morlocks and the sound of their breathing told me there was a crowd of them around. Soon I felt the box of matches being gently pulled from my hand, and other hands began plucking at my clothes. Let go, you fiendish things! Get away! Get away now! My shouting made them draw back briefly. But then they approached me again, more boldly than before, and their whispering and odd noises frightened me horribly. I struck another match, hoping its glare would help me escape. Luckily, I was able to stretch the life of the flame with a scrap of paper I found in my pocket, and I made my way to the tunnel before the burning paper went out. In the blackness, I could hear the Morlocks pattering after me. Soon I was being clutched by several clammy hands trying to haul me back. I lit another match and waved it in the dazzled faces. How nauseatingly inhuman they looked. with their pale, chinless faces and big, lidless, pinkish gray eyes. I kept moving and had to strike my third match to reach the opening of the shaft. As I groped for the projecting bars, my feet were grabbed from behind, and I felt myself being tugged violently backwards. Desperately, I lit my last match, and in the brief second before it went out, my hand had reached the climbing bar. Kicking with all my might, I freed myself from the grasp of the Morlocks and began to climb speedily up the shaft, leaving the ape-like creatures peering up at me. The climb seemed endless, and with only about 20 feet to go, I began to feel dizzy. "Oh no," I prayed. "Please don't let me pass out now." I really had to struggle to keep my hold on the bars and not faint. My head swam, and I felt a falling sensation a few times. Finally, after what seemed like forever, I climbed over the mouth of the well and staggered into the blinding sunlight. I fell upon my face. Even the soil smelled sweet and clean. I remember a faraway feeling that Weena was there, and a dim impression that the other Eloi voices were nearby. Then I blacked out. When I came to, Weena was chanting to herself, "Bad times, bad times, bad times coming." "What do you mean?" I asked. "What bad times?" "Old moon go away. Old moon leave us." "But there'll be a new moon, little warrior. New moon no good. New moon never good for Eloi." "Weena, what are you so upset about?" She shuddered. "Dark nights," she whispered. She seemed so disturbed. I didn't continue the conversation further. I guessed, though, that the sickening Morlocks were at the bottom of her fear, and wondered what evil acts they did under the new moon. Those Morlocks. I was their enemy now, too, and I had to think how to protect myself against them. Clearly, I needed a good weapon and a safe place to sleep. All the buildings and trees I had checked in my wanderings seemed easily reachable by the Morlocks. I knew too well what great climbers they were. Then the tall spears of the Palace of Green Porcelain, as I called the oriental-looking building, and the gleam of its polished walls came back to my memory. That afternoon, taking Weena upon my shoulders like a small child, I headed up the hills southwest for that building. After a while, Weena asked to get down, and she ran along beside me. "Take pretty flowers," she said, stopping every now and then to pick them. "Weena, putting them in special flower place now." I had to smile. Weena had always puzzled over those strange places in my clothing, the pockets. Finally, in a sudden flash of insight, she knew their purpose. Pockets were a funny kind of vase, of course. And that's where she placed the flowers at this point. Here the time traveler broke off his story and addressed the guests in his smoking room directly. In changing my jacket a while ago, I reached into my pocket and found these. He put his hands into his pocket and silently placed 2 large withered white flowers on the table. He stared at them thoughtfully. The anxious guests all remembered their promise not to interrupt, so they waited patiently until he continued. Instead of the green jade building being 8 miles away, as I had estimated, it was more like 18 miles away. In addition, the heel of one of my shoes was loose, and a nail was working its way into the sole of the other. This, combined with a swollen ankle, forced me to discard my shoes and walk in my socks. We ate some fruit we found growing along our way and continued walking towards the Palace of Green Porcelain. We rested for a time as night came on, and as I was guarding the sleeping Weena from the undergrounders, my thoughts turned to the people in this future world. Then suddenly the terrible truth about the Morlocks and the Eloi hit me. "Oh no," I thought. "It's horrible to believe. Yet it all fits together, like pieces in puzzle. The Morlocks tending machinery underground. The Morlocks supplying the Eloi with clothes and food. The Eloi's fear of the Morlocks and of the darkness. And then slaughtered that animal I'd seen in the table in the cavern. It could mean only one thing. The Morlocks raised the Eloi like cattle and used them for their food supply. The Morlocks were cannibals. Chapter 10. Trapped by the Morlocks. At that time I had only vague ideas about what course of action to take, but as I lay awake that night, I calmly reasoned out my most urgent needs. First, I must find a strong weapon, I told myself, then a secure place of refuge, and next I have to find some means of making a torch to use against the Morlocks. Also, I'll need to make some kind of battering ram to break open the bronze doors of the White Sphinx. I was sure that I could rush in through those doors carrying a blaze of light. I could find the time machine and escape from that horrible place with Weena. I had made up my mind to take her back to our own time. Though she wasn't clear in her understanding of where it would be, she was quite eager to go back to my home with me. We continued on our way to the Palace of the Green Porcelain in the morning and reached it about noon. We found it deserted and in ruins. Traces of glass hung in its windows, and large sheets of green facing had fallen away from the rotted metal framework of the building. Inside, instead of the usual large hall as the other building, I found a long gallery lit with many side windows. The tile floor was thick with gray dust, and then I noticed several parts of huge skeletons scattered in the center of the room. They seemed to be of some long-extinct creature from prehistoric times. A brontosaurus, perhaps. "Of course," I cried. "We're in the ancient museum, and this is the fossil room." Along the sides of the gallery were shelves holding glass cases of our own times. They must have been sealed to make them airtight, for the fossils inside them had been fairly well preserved. I figured that the absence of bacteria and fungi in this future world had slowed down the decay of these fossils quite a bit. Exploring further, we came to a small mineral gallery, and then to an area where huge hulks of machines were displayed. Most had rusted and broken down, but some were still in fairly good shape. But I could make only vague guesses as to what they were used for. While I was wondering how I could use these old machines against our enemies, Weena suddenly came up close to me, tugged at my sleeve, then took my hand. "What's the matter, Weena?" I asked. "You look troubled." I had been so wrapped up in the machines that I hadn't noticed the gradual lessening of light or the sloping of the gallery floor. But Weena's fears drew my attention to the fact that the gallery ran down into a thick darkness. The floor at that end had a number of small, narrow footprints. In the remote blackness, I heard a peculiar pattering and the same odd engine noises I had heard down that well. I realized that I still didn't have a weapon to protect us, but I would need one immediately. My eyes traveled over the machines and landed on a huge lever projecting from one of them. Clambering on to the stand and grasping the lever in both my hands, I put all my weight upon it. After a minute's strain, it snapped, and I rejoined Weena, now armed with a club-like weapon in my hand. "Oh, how I'd love to crack some Morlock skulls with this," I said, feeling no hesitation about killing my own descendants. Only concern for leaving Weena and my desire to find my time machine kept me from heading straight into the blackness and killing the Morlocks. We passed through a section of the museum with some book tatters, then up a broad staircase into a really hopeful place, a gallery of chemistry. The gallery was well preserved, and in one of the airtight cases I found a box of matches. Eagerly I tried them. They were perfectly good, not even damp from age. I was so happy I whistled a little tune and whirled about the room in a dance as Weena watched in wonderment. "And that, Miss 802,701, is how we dance in my day," I told her. Then I made another find, a chunk of camphor in a sealed jar. I was just about to throw it away when I remembered something. Camphor can burn, I cried, and this will make a great candle. And I put the chunk into my pocket, along with the matches. It was frustrating next to find a great many guns, pistols, and rifles, but no bullets or gunpowder. Then in another airtight case I found 2 sticks of dynamite. "Eureka!" I shouted, and smashed the case with joy. Taking 1 stick into a little side gallery, I tested it out. I waited 5 minutes, 10, 15, for an explosion, but it never came. They were dummies. Too bad, I told Weena. I might have used them to blow up the doors of the Sphinx to get my time machine, but maybe I can force those doors open with my wonderful iron club. My plan now was to head for the White Sphinx, getting as far as we could now that the night was approaching. I was no longer afraid of sleeping in the open, knowing I had matches and the camphor, and could build a fire to keep the Morlocks away. As we walked, I stopped to pick up a stick and dry grass. With these loaded in my arms, our progress was slowed. When we reached the edge of the forest, which I took to be a mile across, I felt sleep coming on. But then, with the darkness, so were the Morlocks coming on. When we stopped among the black bushes, I spotted 3 of them behind us. "The best thing to do," I said, "is to push on through the forest to the bare hillside, because that should make a safer resting place. The matches and camphor will light our path." I realized that I couldn't deal with both striking matches and carrying firewood at the same time, so I put the wood down. And then it was that I stupidly lit a fire, hoping it would startle our pursuers and cover our retreat. Weena was fascinated by the flames dancing up from my pile of wood. This was the first fire she had ever seen, aside from the match flares. She wanted to run and play with it, and even jump in it, but I picked up her bodily and plunged ahead into the woods. The glare of the fire lit our way pretty well. Soon I began to hear the pattering of feet behind me. I couldn't strike a match because I had Weena on my left arm and my iron bar in my right hand. Voices like those I had heard in the underworld were closing in behind us. Then in another minute I felt a tug at my coat, followed by one at my arm. Weena shuddered violently, and then was still. I had to put her down to light a match. As I fumbled in my pocket, a struggle began in the darkness about my knees. With Weena silent and the Morlocks making peculiar cooing sounds, the spurt of light from my match showed Weena clutching at my feet, her face to the ground. "Weena, Weena!" I cried, bending over her. She was breathing. I lit the camphor block and flung it to the ground, where it split and flared up, then temporarily drove the Morlocks back to the shadows. I knelt down and lifted my unconscious little friend. The woods behind us seemed full of the stir and murmur of a big crowd.